This video is brought to you by the Battle Zoo Bestiary, a new book featuring 100 award-winning monsters and the monster part system that allows players to harvest resources from their fallen foes and craft into custom gear. The Battle Zoo Bestiary is now available at battlezoo.com. Hello and welcome to Troops in Pathfinder 2nd Edition by How It's Played. Troops allow a large number of individuals to function as a single unit. Mechanically, this has a lot of advantages. Rather than having to track a dozen different creatures, the GM only has to manage one large one. And troops can also allow narrative moments where the players are overwhelmed by the sheer number of their foes, but if within the rules they were presented as individuals, they likely would pose little to no challenge for the heroes, but when statted together as a troop they can be formidable. In this regard, troops are not entirely dissimilar from the swarm mechanics used when battling large groups of vermin, but there are a few important distinctions. To illustrate how troops work, we'll be looking at the stat block for a City Guard squadron. Each individual member of the City Guard is a medium-sized creature and occupies one square, but when a large group of them gathers together, they may function as a troop. Most troops begin gargantuan-sized and occupy 16 squares on the map. Typically this is represented as a 4x4 square area, but it can also be 8x2 or other configuration as long as all of the squares are connected. There's no hard rule that dictates how many individuals make up the troop. It may be easiest to think of this as a group of 16 soldiers forming the troop, but that is not a hard rule. Also, it's important to note that as a troop suffers damage, it shrinks in size, which makes sense. As members of the troop are whittled away, the troop itself becomes smaller and smaller. This is represented in the rules by including 2 hit point thresholds. We see here that a City Guard squadron starts with 75 hit points and a parenthetical noting 16 squares. And then we see the 2 thresholds. The first says 50 and 12 squares, meaning that after the City Guard squadron has suffered 25 points of damage, it shrinks in size to 12 squares, and after it suffers another 25 points of damage, it hits its second threshold and shrinks to only 8 squares. There are some special rules regarding how troops suffer damage. First, no individual single target effect can push a troop past 2 thresholds, no matter how much damage it would normally inflict. So for example, if the City Guard squadron had 55 hit points and was hit by a single target attack that managed to deal 35 points of damage, which would normally push the squadron past both its first threshold of 50 and its second threshold of 25, leaving it with only 20 hit points left. Instead, that attack would only lower the troop to 26 hit points, 1 point higher than the second threshold. And note that this only applies to single target attacks, not to damaging area effects or other effects that have more than one target, which makes sense. Decapitating any one member of a troop is unlikely to have such a profound effect on the troop as making it shrink 8 squares in size. Every time a troop is reduced to one of its thresholds, the listed value for that threshold becomes the troop's new maximum hit point value. Meaning, if the City Guard squadron was reduced beyond its first threshold of 50 and left with 40 hit points, and then received 20 points of healing, it would only be able to heal back up to 50 hit points, its most recently passed threshold, and any excess healing would be lost. In order to restore its size and maximum hit points, a troop needs to spend downtime to use long-term treatment on casualties or to recruit new members to replace those that were killed. At 0 hit points, the troop is reduced to 4 squares and can no longer function as a unit. At this point, the troop is defeated and its remaining members either flee, surrender, or are effortlessly killed depending on the troop's nature and the disposition of the players. For any effect that doesn't deal damage, it only applies to the troop if its area encompasses all of the squares that the troop occupies. If the effect has a smaller area, then it usually has no effect on the troop. I say usually because there is an important exception to this. If a non-damaging effect can target at least 4 creatures or cover at least 4 squares that are occupied by the troop, and if this effect would render the targets unable to act for at least one round, or to flee, or have similar debilitating effect where they would not be able to do what they would reasonably want to do on their turn, then the troop is reduced to its next hit point threshold, causing it to lose 4 squares of its size. If an effect would inflict damage and cause 4 squares of the troop to become incapacitated, then you would apply the damage first, and then lower the troop to its next threshold, thus making it possible for the troop to be dropped to threshold by this one effect. So for example, say a player casts Command at the troop. The spell only targets one enemy and therefore has no effect on the troop even if it was to critically fail a save. Making one soldier temporarily incapacitated by a spell will not have a significant impact on the troop as a whole. But if the player heightens the command spell to 5th level, it now targets 10 creatures, and any non-damaging spell that targets at least 4 creatures does have the potential to damage the troop if the result of the spell effect causes the targets to be unable to reasonably act for a turn. So if a player casts Command heightened to 5th level and told the squadron to flee, and the squadron critically failed their will save, then the troop would be dropped to its next hit point threshold and lowered its size by 4 squares to represent the portion of the squadron that ran away. And note that because troops function as a single large creature, you do not roll individual will saves against a spell like this, you would only roll once for the troop. All troops have access to a special ability called Form Up. This costs 1 action and essentially allows the troop to reconfigure itself and adjust its formation. When a troop uses Form Up, the GM selects one of its occupied squares, and all of its other squares may move to any unoccupied space within 15 feet of that chosen square, as long as all of the troop's squares are connected. So a troop shaped like this could spend 1 action on Form Up to arrange itself like this, or like this, or like this. The way a troop moves may vary from troop to troop, but each stat block should include a section on troop movement. Most of them work the same way, so let's look again at the City Guard Squadron as an example. Here it says that whenever the squad uses Stride, it first gets to use Form Up for free to condense it into a square shape, and then it moves as if it was a single creature of that size. This is done for simplicity. Instead of having elaborate rules specifically for the irregular shape of a troop, they just say to squeeze it all into a square shape and then use the already established movement rules for a single creature that is that size. What this means is that a troop like this cannot move as a line, but instead would first form up into a square shape like this, and then move as if it was a single gargantuan sized creature. In a troop that has been pushed past its second threshold that only occupies 8 squares, would form up into a 3x3 square area and move as if it was a single huge size creature. Otherwise, the rules are unchanged. It would stride as usual, spending 1 action to move 25 feet, and if any portion of the troop's area enters a square with difficult terrain, it would be affected as usual. There really aren't any special rules for how troops function in combat, but there are a few shared similarities. Troops function like any normal monster, with an armor class and saving throws to defend itself against incoming attacks. And they also have resistances, immunities, and weaknesses, especially weaknesses against area and splash damage. And each troop has its own attacks listed in their stat block. Most of these attacks will be some manner of area attack, as every member of the troop strikes at once against any enemies within their range, and therefore most troop attacks target reflex and not armor class. For example, City Guard squadrons have 2 attacks, Fire Crossbow and Lower Halberds. Fire Crossbows takes 2 actions and allows the troop to fire their crossbows into a 10-foot burst area within 120 feet of them. Unlike regular crossbow attacks, this one is defended with reflex instead of with armor class. And note that when the troop shrinks in size, so does the area of this attack. And for melee combat, the City Guard Squadron can use Lower Halberds. This attack targets all enemies within 10 feet of any of the troop's spaces and deals an amount of damage based on the number of actions spent. And again, like with most troop attacks, this is resisted by reflex instead of armor class. Those are the general rules for troops. I will say that there are not a lot of hard rules provided for troops. They don't receive a detailed write-up as one might expect, and instead we only have a couple of glossary entries to guide us. As such, there will likely be situations you encounter that there are no hard rules for, and you will need to improvise and make your best rulings as needed. Before we close, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of my patrons. These videos would not be possible without their continued generosity and support. If you would like to support this channel and help it grow, the easiest way to do that is by subscribing and clicking the bell icon so you get notified when new videos release. And I can always be reached through Twitter and Facebook too. Thanks for watching, take care, and happy gaming!